Hello and welcome to Philosophy 405, How to Do Things with Words. This is your lecture for the week, so I'm going to give you an introduction to the Borg piece, the piece by Emma Borg that you're looking at for this week called Meaning and Context. So this article is really looking at this issue that we broached in class on this past week. So one thing we talked about here was the relationship between the pronounced sentence or what is said in conversation and conversational implicatures that arise from that thing. So far, this kind of picture of meaning or communication that we've been developing has a number of different elements to it. So first of all, we've talked about the fact that much communication rests on speakers getting their intentions with the ostensive stimuli they produce, the words they speak, the sentences they say, the words they write. Speakers getting their intentions across using those kinds of signals, right? And hearers picking up on speakers' intentions. And we've talked about the important respect that rules play in allowing us to do this, and how, in fact, the rules or the conventions that govern our language use can allow us to perform a variety of different actions, speech acts, in speaking to one another. So it's not only the case that we can make assertions where we assert things that are true or false, but we can also do other types of things like pass judgments on people, make it come to be that some fact of the world actually holds true, or maybe not judgments only on people, but determinations of how things are, right? Like, so a judge might determine not only a person's guilt, but also where a property line falls. And so now they have changed the world such that the property line falls in that place. People can obviously perform lots of different acts using words. They can enter into contracts. They can enter into marriages. They can cause new obligations to come into place. So it's clear that we can do a variety of things with our utterances. And amongst the things that we can do, right? So it's clear that we can do all of these things, but it's also clear, and in the readings for this past week, we've turned to looking at this fact, it's also clear that people, through saying just a very simple utterance, maybe a mere sentence, can convey lots and lots of information. You know, in the class Symbolic Logic that I also teach, I'll often point out that there's a difference between natural and formal languages, right? And natural languages are like the ordinary languages that we speak to one another, like English, Spanish, Tagalog, Mandarin, and so on. And those differ from kind of formal languages like logic or computer programming languages, symbolic logic or computer programming languages or things like that, in that natural languages are designed for human beings. And because of that, they carry with them oftentimes these two kinds of goals. They want to convey a lot of information and to convey that information efficiently, right? And so because our human languages operate in that way, there's often all of this kind of implicit meaning that's embedded in the things that we say that isn't actually explicitly stated, right? And so Grice offers us in his later work, Logic and Conversation, a kind of window into this, and allows us to see the way in which speakers are able to express a proposition and then use that proposition to actually kind of conversationally implicate lots more information. And hearers similarly are able to understand that speakers are doing this. And the way in which this works is both hearers and speakers know that language or that conversation is governed by certain rules that fall out of a kind of cooperative principle, or that we understand to govern this activity of conversation, which itself is a cooperative activity. But the way Grice was thinking about communication is as essentially consisting of two very different stages. So a speaker says something, right? A speaker makes some sound, so you can imagine like an audio wave, right, of a speaker speaking. Like I'm just going to try to draw like a wave signal of the person's the sounds that are hitting your ear, or you can imagine someone writing out those words. So let me think of a quick example here. So let's suppose that these wave signals could be written as follows: I've eaten, right? And now Grice thinks that we as hearers, or a hearer, will hear these sound waves. These sound waves will impinge on our ear. We'll see these symbols, right? And through processing, we will, be able to recognize these as words, either auditorily spoken words or written words. And Grice thinks there's some kind of process of decoding, right, that goes on here. So we have, he would say, embedded in our mind a language, right, which means we know the rules for the language. And we know the semantic elements, the words in that language and what they mean. Right, so we have a vocabulary which contains the words of the natural language that's being spoken, and we understand the grammatical rules. And by using those things and processing this signal, knowing what the features of the signal are, we are able to decode that and derive some kind of propositional content, which is capable of being true or false. So we might put has eaten as a kind of predicate here, and then mark. And then maybe this response, I've eaten, is given in response to a question, can I fix you some lunch, that someone might ask me. And so if someone asked, can I fix you some lunch? Well, then there's a certain context there. My utterance in this case, I've eaten, even if it has the propositional content, Mark has eaten, it doesn't really satisfy this question. It's sort of off base in some way, right? But of course, the hearer is going to understand the rules that govern language. They're going to see that my utterance doesn't clearly answer the question that was asked, but they're going to assume that I'm not opting out of the cooperative exchange. So Grice's important insight is to realize that at this point, this knowledge of context and knowledge of the cooperative principle, or just the cooperative aspect of communication, right? They can see me standing there in front of them. They can tell I'm not being like obstinate in some way and not trying to answer the question. So they assume I'm still cooperating. And the hearer and the speaker both in the background have this kind of knowledge about the kind of rules of communication that we're going to try to be informative to one another when we're talking. So the thought is, well, I know that in saying I've eaten, I can quickly draw your attention to the kind of salience of this fact in response to your question. And you're going to realize that it has to be important to the question in some way. And so from that, you're going to infer that it's relevant because oftentimes if people have eaten, then they're not full, then they're full right afterwards, and they're don't have a desire to eat more. And so ultimately, you're going to infer something like, it's not the case that Mark wants food. Because you're going to infer the answer to your question. But importantly for Grice, these are like two totally different stages. So what's going on here is this very deductive process that is not context sensitive, or at least not very context sensitive. And what's going on here is a highly context sensitive inductive process, an inferential process, in other words, that can have some kind of probabilistic success, but not 100% success, maybe. Okay, so the debate today is really focused on this stage. So we're thinking about this stage here, okay? Borg is walking us through this stage. Now, it's important to recognize that this proposition, and I've mentioned this in class, this proposition, the primary proposition that's conveyed by the utterance, is of critical importance to Grice, and it's of critical importance because of its truth functionality, right? Its truth value in some way factors into making a difference to the implicature that's calculated, or the conditions under which it's true factor into making a difference to what's implicated, right? So let's think of an example. Right, so I mean, it's easiest to see this with the maxim of quality. So if we think of a kind of violation of the maxim of quality, so I say, sorry, if I say something like, okay, so one example that was used in the podcast you might have listened to was you go into this person's house and the furniture's all broken, and you say, what happened here? And the person's friend says, oh, Dan came home a little drunk last night, right? So that is maybe false, right? I mean, he wasn't a little drunk, he was very drunk. And in any case, it doesn't carry a high degree of information. So really the kind of like truth value of this utterance is what's important to, or the kind of truth conditions attached to this utterance are what's important to starting off the chain of reasoning in this case, okay? So it seems that this thing that is derived from the words that are pronounced initially has to have two important features. It has to be truth conditional, right? So there have to be conditions under which it's true or false, and our judging its truth or falsity and related issues of the kind of information that it conveys is really the critical thing to start off this whole process of reasoning, right? That's involved here. But now, Grice also claims, right, that this thing is so point one is it's truth conditional. Point two is it is derived compositionally. And that just means from the word that is spoken. I mean, from the sentences that are pronounced, we can just build this meaning up, okay? So, essentially the debate that we're talking about here turns on the desire to try to satisfy both of these conditions. So we need the thing to be truth conditional because that's what's important to all of the kind of inferential reasoning to what is implicated that Grice has pointed out. And in many cases, it seems like something that is truth conditional, or the particular truth conditions that we associate with what is said, are not derivable from the element that's pronounced. Okay, might have gotten a little bit in the weeds there. So let's talk a little bit more about this. Again, really the debate here is the degree to which this thing, right, has eaten is just derivable from what is pronounced, given some specific rules and a kind of understanding of the meanings of the words, or the degree to which it actually depends upon these kind of more general contextual features that are pointed out over here, right? So the question is really, are these two processes, right? I'm gonna just name these 1, 2, and 3. Are the process that gets us from 1 to 2 and the process that gets us from 2 to 3, are those really as different as people like Grice have thought? Or indeed, is our understanding of what is said, or as I'll sometimes call it, the primary proposition, does that depend just as much on inferences from the context of utterance, right? So really the degree is, or the question is, what is the degree to which context of utterance and inference enters into the calculating of the kind of primary proposition that's conveyed by the sentence? Okay, so that's what Borg's piece is all about, right? You'll notice that I've shifted from talking about what is said to the idea of a primary proposition. I think this is because, I mean, the way in which I prefer to talk about a primary proposition, the way I'll just defend that, or I'll define that, is just as a primary proposition is just the truth conditional content which inferentially grounds implicated content. So it's like the first truth conditional aspect of meaning. And it's the thing that we rely upon in inferring the conversational implicatures that are expressed if we're hearers. So it is the inferential ground for that whole implicative process that Grice points to. It's logically prior to implicated content. That is, what is implicated depends on the meaning of what is said having been this certain thing, or the primary proposition having been this certain thing. That just means that, you know, we can't infer the implicature without having this specific meaning, without knowing the primary proposition. But it may not actually, and we talked a little bit about this in class the other day, it may not actually be temporally prior to our calculating of the implicature. Because sometimes, like an implicature, like some of the students, the implicature that not all of the students failed from the utterance, some of the students failed, that may be automatic in certain ways. So we may not actually work through this process in some way. But the fact that we understand that not all of the students failed, that's still grounded in the fact that the speaker meant that is still grounded in the fact that they said this particular thing and these kinds of implicative rules. Okay, so our question is, how is the propositional content from which hearers infer a speaker's conversational implicatures arrived at in linguistic processing? I might put some commas in here. So how is the propositional content, the primary propositional content, let's say, how is the primary propositional content from which hearers infer a speaker's conversational implicatures arrived at in linguistic processing? And all of the positions we're looking at today give different answers to this question, okay? So some say it is just arrived at in this very minimal, straightforward way that Grice might point to, which is just you have these words, you decode them, you know the grammar of the language, and you therefore just deduce what the propositional content that was expressed is, the primary propositional content is. Others, such as contextualists, will say, no, the primary propositions are partially determined by the more or less extensive use of kind of inferential pragmatic processes, which depend on the particular context of utterance, okay? So minimalists say it's just derived from the pronounced elements of a spoken sentence, contextualists say no, it really depends upon context. So this is really a question about processing, linguistic processing. And we're going to look at some of the arguments for the different positions in this debate. But first, I think it's important to point out that some of the arguments that people have used to suggest that a primary propositional content, in order to calculate that thing, a hearer must refer to the context and make inferences about the context. So let's talk about a couple of these examples. One of them comes from Borg. So early in Emma Borg's article, she discusses the following example, right? So I'm just going to read through this. In this paper, I want to survey a contemporary debate about the place of context in determining meaning. The debate has turned on examples like the following. Imagine a fridge which contains only a small puddle of milk on its floor, right? So we're supposed to imagine that there's nothing else in this fridge. No jugs of milk, no beer, no ham, no cheese, nothing else aside from a small puddle of milk on the floor of the fridge, okay? So now imagine two different contexts in which a conversation regarding this fridge takes place. In scenario one, Hugo is dejectedly stirring a cup of black coffee. Noticing this, Odell says, "There's milk in the fridge." And now imagine scenario two. Hugo has been cleaning the fridge. Odell opens the fridge door and says, "There's milk in the fridge." Okay? So the thought is, if Odell says this in response to seeing Hugo dejectedly stir his coffee, if he says there's milk in the fridge, he says something false because there's not milk in the fridge that Hugo can put into his coffee, which is the relevant context, or the relevant kind of milk for this particular context. However, if Odell says there's milk in the fridge after Hugo's been cleaning the fridge, this empty fridge, then he says something true because the milk on the floor of the fridge is relevant to that context. Right? Like the context of utterance is one, we're trying to produce a clean fridge, not one where we're trying to milk some coffee. Okay? So it seems like the truth conditions of what Odell has said change in this case based upon the context, because Odell has said the same thing, and yet in the first instance what Odell has said is true or is false, whereas in the second context what Odell has said is true, right? So given that the sentence hasn't changed, the pronounced words haven't changed, then something else must be changing the meaning. And it seems like what must be changing the meaning is the context in general. So context is actually leading to a different truth conditional content in this case. These examples are taken from Charles Travis, a very influential contextualist author, though his work is somewhat difficult to read. But he says, although there is no ambiguity in the English words, "there's milk in the refrigerator," or none relevant to the differences between the two scenarios, Odell's words in the first case said what was false, while in the second case they said what was true. Both spoke of the same state of the world, or the same refrigerator in the same condition. So in the first case, the words said what is false of a refrigerator with but a milk puddle. In the second case, they said what is true of such a refrigerator. Okay, so the truth value changes across different contexts, even though what is said hasn't changed across those contexts. So it must be that, the words that are pronounced don't change across that context. So it must be that working out that kind of primary proposition that's expressed, which is true in one case and false in the other, depends upon this kind of more general background knowledge about the context. I discussed two more examples in my handout. I call arguments of this kind, and so does Borg, by the way, context shifting arguments. So context shifting arguments are arguments in which the truth condition of a pronounced sentence seems to change across different contexts, even though the sentence itself doesn't change in any way. Okay, if the sentence is remaining the same, but the conditions of its truth seem to change in some way, then that seems to be an issue. Also, I will point to two other arguments for contextualism. These are a bit like context shifting arguments, but maybe a little bit different in some way. These are additional reasons for thinking that context of utterance is important in leading us to determine the primary propositional content of a spoken sentence. So the two examples are involving involving sort of ordinary but somewhat strange instances of communication. So the first of these is an example involving non-sentential speech. Okay, so I want you to consider the following utterance. So the utterance is embedded in a context. So imagine my wife and I are expecting 2 deliveries, a new couch and her work computer. We get home from grocery shopping to find a FedEx failed delivery slip on the door. I pull it off, read it, and say to my wife, the couch. Okay, so there's a question here. It seems like I implicate something in this case. What I seem to implicate is that FedEx tried to deliver the new couch, right? I think my wife would understand this in this context. But now the question is, well, by means of what primary proposition do I implicate this? And it seems to be that I implicate this by means of the proposition that the failed delivery slip concerns the couch. But now look, I never actually said the failed delivery slip concerns the couch in this case. So content A is not derivable from words I've actually pronounced. All I said was the couch, right? So how did she get to this meaning which can be true or false? Well, here's an argument built on this case. Well, the Gricean picture requires that what is said satisfy 2 conditions, right? Grice thinks it should be syntactically correlated, so he thinks it's derivable from uttered words with very limited reference to context. Yet it also needs to be the case that it inferentially grounds implicatures. Now, in this, and presumably many other cases of non-sentential speech, nothing derivable from the actually uttered or pronounced words is sufficient to inferentially ground the implicatures that are actually derived. What I've said here, the couch, is not capable of being true or false, right? So the pronounced words aren't going to be sufficient to give us that truth functional content. So in this numerous cases of non-sentential speech, there is nothing that satisfies Grice's notion of what is said. However, some primary proposition must ground implicatures in cases like this. My wife, after all, does come to understand that FedEx tried to deliver the new couch in this case, so there must be some proposition she's working from. It seems then that primary propositions are inferred from the uttered words with extensive reference to context in this and other cases. And so what this seems to suggest is a kind of corollary that there's going to be extensive pre-propositional pragmatic processing in figuring out the primary propositional content. Other examples rely upon what we might call inappropriate syntactic correlates. So consider this utterance. Robin is borrowing a folding table from Frank for a garden party. This comes from the paper I was thinking of having you read, but I eliminated this week, so Karsten 2004. After he arrives at the table, Frank asks Robin, "Where should I put it?" She replies, "There's a rectangle of lawn in the back." Now, Frank is not at a loss as to where to put the table when he finds the back lawn to be a rhomboid or some like slightly off shape. It's not strictly a rectangle, right? So again, we ask ourselves, well, what is Robin implicating And what will Frank infer in this instance? So Frank will infer that Frank should set up the table in the roughly quadrilateral piece of lawn at the back of the house. And now the question is, by means of what primary proposition does Robin implicate this? And it seems that the way in which she implicates this is through the proposition, the primary proposition expressed, that there's a roughly quadrilateral piece of lawn at the back of the house. But of course, she didn't say roughly quadrilateral piece of lawn. She said rectangular piece of lawn. And there's not a rectangular piece of lawn at the back of the house. It's a rough quadrilateral. So what's going on here? Well, again, we can run a similar kind of argument to previous. In any instance of communication, the Gricean picture requires that what is said satisfy two conditions. It be syntactically correlated, that is, it's derivable from uttered words with very limited reference to context, and that it inferentially grounds the actually derived implicatures. So in this, and presumably many other cases of inappropriate syntactic correlates, though a proposition is arguably derived from the uttered words, it's insufficient to inferentially ground the specific implicatures that are actually derived via Gricean mechanisms. So in the numerous cases of inappropriate syntactic correlates, there's nothing that satisfies Grice's notion of what is said. But some primary proposition grounds what is actually implicated in cases of inappropriate syntactic correlates. Therefore, primary propositions are inferred from whatever propositional components are derivable from the pronounced words, together with extensive reference to context. And it seems to follow from this again that there's extensive pre-propositional pragmatic processing. Now, there are various ways of trying to deal with these kinds of cases, and Borg's paper discusses a number of these. Borg sort of puts these on kind of a progressive list of more and more extremism as you go along. I'm going to quickly mention a couple of these. So one is minimalism, and minimalism is really kind of the first one Borg discusses, and we can think of the other positions as departing from minimalism by rejecting some of its key claims. So as laid out by Borg, minimalism consists of the following claims. It holds that the route to semantic content goes exclusively via syntax. That is to say, every element found at the semantic level must be traceable to something at the syntactic level. So if there is something that contributes to the meaning of the proposition expressed, then there has to be a word in there or some other kind of semantic element like a tense or a kind of different phrase of the word, right? A modification of the word that conveys that meaning, right? So that's one component of minimalism, that the route to semantic content goes exclusively via syntax. Semantic content is complete, minimalism holds, and that is to say, it is content at the level of a proposition or truth condition, right? So syntactic, we have the syntactic correlation constraint, which is something that Grice seems to accept, that we go straight through the words. We also have the idea that semantic content is complete, it's truth conditional. And then an additional kind of idea that's maybe added on to Grice in later authors, but I think is fair, is that there may be elements that cause us to refer to context, but these are to be found in the syntax of our language. And they're the intuitively obvious ones, right? So words like this and that, not man or red, right? So this and that are thought to be demonstratives. They clearly require us, like if I say, what is this? You're going to require me to kind of like point to the thing I'm talking about, maybe not literally point, but the context in some way is going to determine what this refers to. So there are some obvious examples where we have to convert or consult context, but they're in the minority. By and large, we can just recover the meaning from the sentence itself. So minimalism is kind of the most extreme position. It really is kind of the position that that Grice accepts. There are some worries here. You can look at those a little bit, see how it deals with the CSAs. I'm just going to look at two other elements here. well, actually, I'll look at yeah, three others. Okay, so all these other positions rest upon denying something that minimalism accepts. One position, indexicalism, rejects the third component, that the only context-sensitive elements to be found in the syntax of our language are the intuitively obvious ones. So indexicalists suggest that many words have embedded within them a determiner that tells us to look at the context of utterance. If you have, for example, so if I say it's raining, right? So imagine I say it is raining. Okay, this is a kind of classic example of indexicalism. If I say that right now in Appleton, it is false. If you say that or if someone else says that, let's say in a rainforest in Brazil, it's true, right? So it seems in some case that the truth of that utterance depends upon the context, but it doesn't include any of these kind of obvious context-sensitive elements like this or that. So what indexicalists will say is that utterances like it's raining have these kind of embedded hidden context elements that tell us to look at the context. And in this case, it's going to, there's going to be embedded in the sentence this extra content here, let's say, right? So indexicalists say that there are built into language all these indexes that cause us to look at the context of utterance. Even though they're not pronounced, they're in some way embedded in the deep structure of what is said. And so when I say it's raining, right, it's not like one of the traditional context-sensitive semantic elements that tells us to look at context, but embedded in there is this little element that says, okay, look at the particular situation where the person is, and that's going to fill out the truth claim. All right, so that's indexicalism. Contextualists adopt two of minimal semantics claims, but they reject A. So they're going to reject one, not the same one that the indexicalist rejects, but they're going to reject component A. So they're going to say, okay, semantic content is complete. So that is to say that what is said is at the content, what is said is at the level of a proposition or a truth condition. And they're also going to say that the only context sensitive elements to be found in the syntax of our language are the intuitively obvious ones, words like this and that, right? So they're going to deny these kind of hidden indexical elements. But instead what they're going to say is, well, something is derived from those actual pronounced words, but it's often not enough to get us all the way to a truth conditional content. They might rely on some of the arguments we were pointing to earlier about inappropriate syntactic correlates or incomplete utterances, right? So they're going to say, well, in those cases, you can derive something maybe, but it's not propositional. And context is just going to contribute to semantic content simply because that's what is demanded by context. So it's not like rule-based in some way. It's just that we're like reasoning creatures who can figure this stuff out. So that's another kind of picture. And then the last kind of view is occasionalism. And so occasionalists are going to say, they're going to reject two of these views. I'm not going to talk a lot about added parameters because it's pretty difficult to get, but let's talk about occasionalism, right? So they're going to say that the route to they're going to deny that the route to semantic content goes exclusively via syntax, and they're also going to deny that the only context-sensitive elements of our language are the kind of traditional ones. Instead, they're going to say, they're going to claim that semantic content is complete, right? So that the primary propositional content is complete, that is, that it can be true or false. But they're very much going to think that there's a deep shiftiness in language such that we often have to rely upon special features. One of the main people who puts forward this view is Ludwig Wittgenstein in Philosophical Investigations. And I've included two quotes here that you can think about. So essentially, what Grice wants, I mean, what Wittgenstein wants to say, and we can talk a little bit about a little bit more about this later, is that in answering the question, what does a word mean? We're invariably answering the question, what does the word do? So really, semantic for Wittgenstein and others, these words are like tools, and both of these analogies point to the tools. They can be used to do different things, but that doesn't fully determine what their actual contribution is going to be, right? Just like you might use a hacksaw to produce something that looks a certain way in one case, or to produce something that looks a different way in another case. So the same word, right? It's a kind of tool that can get us to a certain place, but it can be used on the context in different ways to produce different outcomes. Okay. Ultimately, Borg thinks that the middle positions here are not going to be sustainable. So we're going to be forced into minimalism or occasionalism. We can talk about that argument a little bit more this week. I've put up now your homework for this week, and it's going to ask you to think about these positions more deeply. So that's what I want you to spend your time doing in the next few days, is just getting clear on why we might think that that we can moving from the pronounced sentence to the primary propositional content, like what Grice would call what is said, why we might think that that actually depends upon this like deep inferential context sensitive process. And then I want you to think about these 5 positions, and your homework is to choose the one that you think is the most correct and to explain why you think it's the most correct. So I don't think the article this week is very long. I've given you like a 6-page handout also to work from, but it is challenging in certain ways. I think everything we've been reading up to this point is. So be sure to set aside plenty of time to think about it. And I look forward to talking with you more about it soon.